everyone's informed by the context in which they grew up in.
For sure.
And, as I said to you before, media in this country has operated in a default. A lot of these journalists and editors have been in, the mainstream media landscape for 10, 20, 30 years. You could excuse ignorance, but at some point you have to become educated to a point where you start making informed decisions.
Hello, welcome back to Bogan Intel. Today's episode's a bit of a special one. I met with former Guardian journalist and Deep Cut founder Antoun Issa at a local bakery for a bit of a chat about the industry, about journalism, about what it's like working in the legacy media and some of the frustrations, and how it is being outside of it as an independent. Antoun's insight into legacy media as someone who worked for over a decade, but also his experience living and breathing his profession in the Middle East has helped him provide a really great product at Deep Cut, which is really cutting through some of the boundaries that the legacy media can't seem to overcome. Check out this cool interview with Antoun. Thank you very much for joining us, Antoun, at the iconic Al Alami in Coburg, one of the best places we could meet. How you doing?
Good. And this is an old stomping ground because my family used to come and get their bread from, around here in Coburg 30 years ago.
Really?
Yeah.
But look, great to have you, and great to meet you in Coburg. And I wanted to speak to you a little bit, about journalism and independent journalism potentially today, and really wanting to know a little bit more about who you are for the audience and what you're doing. People might know you from Deep Cut News, which is a fairly new publication, but yeah, if you could just explain a little bit about who Antoun is.
Who am I?
Yeah.
So I've been a journalist for too long. This is a short answer. I went to Lebanon, Beirut, 2011 to work as a journalist.
Yeah, wow.
And that was the height of the Arab Spring. It was revolutions all over the Arab world. It was the big story of the day. Egypt was happening. Syria was kind of happening. Libya, Yemen. So I kind of threw myself in the midst of that in Beirut. And yeah, I stayed there for 3 years, and that's 3 or 4 years. And that was a time of covering civil war in Syria. It was a time of the various Gaza wars that kept occurring. You had ISIS emerge in Iraq and Mosul and in parts of Syria, the destruction of Aleppo. There were so many seismic things happening. You had Egypt become a revolutionary kind of country and then become a counter-revolutionary country with a more repressive regime, which is still the case today. You saw Libya kind of disintegrate and get destroyed by the US and NATO forces. So a lot was happening. And next thing you know, I'm at The Guardian in Australia, and I ended up having a mid to senior editorial role. And I stayed there for 4 years, and then I left because of my objections over their Gaza coverage. And I was writing a book, and I had a book in the process, which I've just submitted my last edits a few weeks ago. That's going to be published next year. It's a book situated in the Lebanese civil war. And I launched Deep Cut. So I went back to what I guess my calling is, which is journalism, truthful journalism, unfiltered journalism that actually holds the powerful to account and doesn't pretend to be.
I just want to go back to what you sort of said. Like, you were based in Beirut. You had the fall of Mosul, you had the rise of ISIS. You saw Libya, you saw Gaddafi getting dragged through the streets.
I didn't see him personally.
But this is where we saw, the world saw. You had Egypt, as you said, falling and then falling again.
Yeah.
And the the whole area was seismic, and there seemed to be so much kind of agitation going on. What would you say for you was the biggest story you covered, or the most important story you were involved with there?
I think it was Syria. Because there was a lot happening. My 2 main beats were Syria and Gaza. And Syria was, we could see it disintegrating in front of us. And I think for Lebanese, there's a proximity to that because we, remove the colonial borders, it's pretty much the same country, right? So it's not like it's a country far away. It's our sister and it's our neighbor. Lebanese families are intertwined to Syrian families. We have a shared history, we have a shared culture, a shared ethnicity. We're the same people.
And
So-
Lebanese used to holiday to Damascus all the
Right,
time and
right.
buy gold and all sorts of stuff, right?
But that also means we're intertwined in each other's affairs. So the Lebanese civil war, for example, in the 70s and 80s, had huge Syrian involvement, right? Like they were players in the midst of it. I call it a Levantine civil war because you had Palestinian players, you had Syrian players, you had Lebanese players, they were all in there. And the reverse was true of the Syrian situation, right? Like there was significant Lebanese involvement, one with Hezbollah being involved in support of the regime, the Assad regime. But then also you had a lot of sympathy for the Islamist rebels from the more Sunni Islamist side of Lebanon, particularly in the north, in Tripoli, where those ties between Tripoli and cities like Homs and Aleppo and Idlib are quite strong. So, the Syrian civil war is never a Syrian civil war. The Lebanese civil war is never a Lebanese civil war. Whatever happens in either country, we're all involved in it. So, seeing that decay, knowing the politics of Syria, and being like, you guys are just, are heading down this path towards mayhem and hell. It was hard to kind of see and watch and disintegrate, particularly when you saw the huge damage inflicted on Syria. The destruction of Aleppo, the bombing of neighborhoods in Homs, parts of Damascus, like destroyed, and it was really painful to see, and it was the biggest story because Syria, it is the most important piece of Levant. So Levant being Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan. Geopolitically, it's the most important piece. And if Syria kind of disintegrates and crumbles, it kind of leaves the entire Levant significantly weaker. And we're seeing the ramifications of that now, right? Like Israel is just arrogantly asserting its total dominance over the Levant. It's bombing Syria whenever it wants to. It moves into Syria whenever it wants to. Takes territory whenever it wants to. It can do whatever it wants.
Like the David's Corridor, for example, and things like that, right?
Yeah, and they're doing the same in Lebanon as we're seeing right now. Like that, they're asserting their ability to just do whatever they want, whenever they want. So the fall of Syria as a powerful, not a powerful, but as a cohesive state, has been a huge kind of like. The fall of the Syrian state as a cohesive state has had dramatic ramifications. And so I think that's the biggest story. Gaza, I covered Gaza a bit. I had a team of Palestinian journalists in Gaza that, I recruited and assembled, and we did some fantastic journalism inside Gaza, showcasing the life in Gaza, the Palestinian life, the way of life, how it was continuing despite living essentially in a concentration camp where they had restrictions on even the amount of calories they were entering every day, but they still made life work. And so I think what we tried to showcase was that Gazan society, like every society in the world, has its kind of flavors, it has its tensions, whether it's, the societal push and pull between Hamas's desire to Islamize society versus parts of Gaza that didn't want to Islamize themselves to that extent. Those tussles were kind of interesting to see occur within a society that's under a really, really fierce occupation. And then the occupation would remind everyone of their, destructive present. In 2014, in the summer 2014, there was one of the Gaza wars, one of the many mini Gaza wars now. Several thousand were killed in Gaza, and it was a really tough time, even for the journalists that were reporting on the ground.
There was a lot going on, and you were focusing on a lot around the region. Like every contiguous neighbor in Lebanon was sort of under the flame, right, at that time.
Right.
Like the whole idea of where you'd been, right bang center in the middle of Beirut around 2011, like one of the most tumultuous times in the region. It was like a chance to see like a real situation on this earth, like almost like as a war correspondent, or like to see war firsthand. Something that seems to be really missing from journalists in Australia or in the collective West. that lived experience that defines their work,
Yeah,
and what they see with their eyes.
yeah.
Do you think that like it's integral for journalists who cover what you do to be based, in places where if you're covering war and conflict, is it integral to spend time in places of war and conflict to understand the nature of these kind of situations?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think you can't eliminate or minimize the incredible insight and I guess enhanced understanding one gets of the subject matter if that's by experiencing that subject matter.
If you're liking what you're getting here with Bogan Intel, I can't stress how important it is that you just hit that bloody subscribe button down there and the like button, potentially leave a comment. Because this is the only thing that's kind of boosting us in this incredible algorithmic soup. And we're just a fledgling little show, but we're getting some really good guests. And everything that you can do to help out means so much to us compared to some of those titans, which don't really seem to care anymore. If you can support the channel or head to www.boganintel.com to check out all my articles and links to some of this video content, it would be more than appreciated. Thank you. And like in this era of conflict, probably from the Ukraine war onwards, through to October 7 and onwards, in the collective West, there's been a lot of attention on these conflict zones, in this new kind of period. But you see in the way that the ABC News sort of reports on these stories in sort of absentia. And it feels like there's a lot of like establishment narratives being woven through the way that war and conflict is reported today. Do you feel that's like due to a lack of lived experience from a lot of journalists?
Um, yeah, I think that's a big part of the question. I think that's a big part of the issue that a lot of the journalists, particularly in a place like Australia, where we're so far removed from things from the world, we're so far away, and also we don't really place a lot of emphasis or importance on global issues as part of our national discourse. Like foreign affairs and world affairs doesn't really feature as prominently in Australian media landscape and discourse as it does, say, for example, in the US and even in parts of Europe. Um, and so you don't have a big school of Australian journalists who have spent significant time overseas, really immersed in um, societies in which they aspire to cover. You'll get, you'll get maybe the ABC will send someone on a posting for a few years in one spot, but often that's accompanied with living in a very, like I can speak on the example of the Middle East. You're living in a an affluent part of a neighborhood of a city that's full of expats. Your immediate community are all Western immigrants who are in the foreign policy or the so even when they are stationed over there, they're not really immersed in the society that they're meant to be covering. They're incredibly removed from it. So we don't have a significant cohort in Australian media who understand the societies and the complexities of those nations and the countries that they're covering. And you can see that in the output of the journalism with regard to these areas. Like if you look at the coverage of not just Gaza, but look at the whole region um, over the last 2 years. As someone who knows the region, I look at the coverage being like, it's so obvious that there's such a dearth in knowledge and understanding of the context, of the politics, of the history, of the society. And if you don't have that context, it's really hard to then write on it as if or speak on it or cover it from a position of authority.
You can see even that with like, journalists that or seemingly want to tell the story. Like, I saw, you see Matthew Doran from Ashdod, for example, trying to, give an insight to what's going on behind
Right.
that wall there. It's very difficult, right?
Yeah, totally difficult. And, but also the flip side to that is that it's not that that knowledge doesn't exist. It certainly does in Australia. The advantage that we have here that we haven't utilized is the fact that we are an incredibly multicultural society. And when I say multicultural, I don't mean multicultural in like 100-year sense. I mean, like, we're a recently multicultural society. So you have new immigrants and recent immigrants from a lot of these parts of the world, people in this country that are still actively connected to those parts of the world either through relations, family relations. They visit very frequently. They might even split their time between here and there. Places like Sudan or Greece or Turkey or Lebanon or Vietnam, China, India. So we have access to all of these countries and all these societies, to the communities that already live here. The problem with Australian media is that it's very Anglo-centric, and not just Anglo-centric, but Anglo elite-centric. It's a very small community, and they kind of act as like gatekeepers to mainstream media, and that's why, for example, they'll send the Matthew Dorans of the world to, Israel Palestine, and not someone of, say, maybe Palestinian or Lebanese extraction to the region who might actually understand a bit more of the complexities and could enrich the coverage because they have access to those societies and understand those societies. You don't get that from Australian media.
What's the rationale from management or the people that send the Matthew Dorans out to send the Matthew Doran out as opposed to someone from, an ethnic background in Australia?
They see people of diverse backgrounds as liabilities because they have in their view, they have a proximity to the issue. Oh, you can't possibly do your job properly as a journalist because, you're an Arab covering an Arab country, an Arab society, or you're a Chinese person covering China, or you're or a Sudanese covering Sudan. You can't possibly give us
With a dearth of understanding
right.
and knowledge and
and they hide it behind this notion of impartiality and objectivity. You can't be objective if your skin is in the game. That's essentially what they're saying.
Yeah.
But my response to that is that, and my response to that when I had that experience at The Guardian was that your notion of objectivity isn't objective. It's you're imposing your white colonial, even your objective lens is informed by subjectivity, which is a construction of a white colonial lens in how you view all these parts of the world. That's not objective. That's a white colonial lens, right? So this notion of objectivity and using that as like a cover to not send people of color or indigenous people indigenous to those areas to cover those stories, it doesn't fly. It doesn't fly at all. But that's the rationale that exists amongst management that are, overwhelmingly Anglo-Saxon and overwhelmingly recruited from the same pool of journalists and editors that have hovered around the industry for 20, 30 years, right? It's a very small pool. They don't want to cede space to the reality of Australia, which is like we are a diversified nation. There are millions in this country that don't come from an Anglo background, and they are Australian, and they need to have their voices considered and heard and their perspectives brought in. But these editors, they want to hang on and keep sending the Matthew Dorans out instead of, someone from that region to cover the story. Yeah.
And I'm sure they have the best intentions. And you can see, the frustration in some of these journalists with one hand tied behind their back. I remember that footage of Doran in the plane, in the cargo plane flying over Gaza, and he got a chance to actually sort of speak his mind a little bit. And you see little cracks of sunlight coming through these reporters, but it's very hard as the narrative's so managed. And, it seems to coincide too, like this, parroting sort of narratives from maybe Washington or via, a sanitized Israeli government report or something like that. It's coming at a time when we're like increasingly involved in these kind of forever wars and these wars abroad. So, we're losing that lack of like journalistic insight and subject matter expertise, or deliberately so, at a time when we're also complicating our involvement in some of these conflicts. And as we've seen around Israel, the Australian government involvement right now is it's pretty strong,
right?
And there's a military, diplomatic, and economic normalcy being maintained in Canberra, bipartisan, and weapons deals and things like that happening business as usual. So yeah, it's quite strange how not quite strange. There's a rationale behind it that lived experience and people with expertise on a certain area are actually removed in favour of someone parroting a narrative or a memo coming from above, right?
Well, it's not just someone parroting a narrative. It's because I think it's also unfair on the reporter. Like this is not a slight on people on Matthew Doran. Like we've mentioned.
No, not at all. He's cool. Matthew Doran's all right.
Yeah. It's about the system in place that preferences that over, say, lived experience or having authentic perspectives from those communities that are part of Australian discourse, and they're not, and in Australian society, and they're not welcome in mainstream media. So this is more about when you don't have that context and when you don't have that that invaluable, unique understanding that might come from people who do come from those societies and understand those complexities. The way stories are then compiled is that you end up just becoming essentially a press release journalist, which is that I'm going to go to, if I'm putting a story together, I'll go to the Israeli government and see what they say, what their spokesperson says. Then I might go to a Palestinian organization and get what their spokesperson says. Then I just cobble it together and put a top on top, and that's it. So it's barely, it's not even touching the surface, right? Because ultimately, as a press release journalist, that's when you become someone who just parrots what powerful institutions have to say, who are deliberately spinning things because they know you don't have the context and understanding to go deeper and ask the tough questions. And you probably don't even have the leeway to ask the tough questions because you have editors at the top who have their own biases, and we've seen those biases play out, particularly at places like the ABC, where till this day they're refusing to use the word genocide for Gaza, but they've just used the word genocide for Sudan. In the face of the UN coming up in their commission of inquiry saying that Israel has indeed committed acts of genocide in Gaza. So you end up being a parrot of power because that's the only lane you're given. And so your article, and so we did a study, for example, at Deep Cut with News Corp in the UK, just doing a quantitative analysis of ABC stories, digital stories, from October 2023 to May 2025. And it showed that the Israeli official perspective was given more weight in articles than anything else, more than the Palestinians for sure, and even more than international organizations like the UN, who are the experts in this regard. So you end up becoming, by default, a parrot for power, and in the ABC's case, a parrot for the perpetrators of a genocide. And that's why the tag of complicity gets thrown about, the ABC being complicit in the genocide of Gaza, because it's not that they're just denying the Palestinians a voice or minimizing the Palestinian voice, but they're actively parroting Israeli government spin to camouflage the war crimes that are being committed. And it all connects the dots. If you had someone who really understood the context of the area, they would be in those newsrooms, they'd be pushing back against those editors who have those, really narrow limitations. And they'd be trying to find ways to bring more truth to the story. When you don't have that, though, and when you have, say, an Anglo journalist like a Matthew Doran, who doesn't understand the background, doesn't understand the context, has never covered from the Middle East before. This is all very new to this person. Right. Very little experience, very little knowledge. You get press release journalism, you get parroting of a government accused of committing genocide.
And this is also encouraged upstairs, right? This form of journalism. So I want to ask, is this the new school of journalism in the most concentrated media landscape outside of China and Egypt?
No, it's the school that's how it's always been. I don't think we've ever covered foreign affairs or foreign international stories in a way that doesn't align with powerful interests, particularly powerful interests aligned with what the Australian political establishment favours. So Australia is part of, the US, I guess, empire, so to speak. I wouldn't say it's an alliance because I don't think we're equal with the US. I think we're very much subordinate to the US. And part of that empire is Israel. And so we have as the Australian political establishment is firmly aligned with probably one of the most evil states on the face of the earth. And because of that alignment, it kind of puts the media establishment, which is closely intertwined to that political establishment, also in that same camp. So I don't think this is new. This is very much how things have always been, as far as I've been concerned. I've been in Australia since I was born, 40 years ago. And my childhood, looking at Australian TV screens and reading Australian papers talking about the Middle East, was always in favour of Israel. There was barely any mention, there was barely not a notion of humanising the Arab or the Muslim. What the difference now is, it's been exposed and there's been significant pushback. And to the point where it's not just coming from within media circles, not just journalists who are like, what's going on here? audiences are now being like, we can see on our phones kids are being slaughtered every day. Why do you keep giving us Israeli talking points? Why do you keep denying a genocide when on our screens we can see a genocide? Right? So the media have been exposed. The ABCs of the world, the Guardians of the world have been exposed for not telling you what's going on.
Totally.
Because of that implicit bias, because of the connections with the political establishment which favors, the alliance with Israel.
So you talk about these, we've been running these alliance narratives or these empire narratives in our media for so long. And, there's been it's been revealed, it's been busted here with a genocide. I mean, is this the media apparatus just testing the waters? Seeing if we could actually roll this genocide into this coverage, for the last, 40 or 50 years of augmenting the projection of Middle East conflict. Was this them just having another crack at trying to, frame a genocide in a certain acceptable language, of that old language?
I said I don't think it's active in that sense. I think it's just default.
Yeah.
This is how it's always been. So for these editors and these journalists who cover it in this way, for them, they're acting in the default. They think this is journalism.
Yeah.
But they're convinced of it.
Yeah.
Oh, we've always done it this way. We've always treated Israel as a legitimate democratic government, and therefore we will prioritize everything they have to say, even though it's obvious that they're committing war crimes.
Yeah.
Right? We've always dehumanized Palestinians. They've always been the terrorists. So we'll continue to cover Hamas as if they're terrorists, and we won't even question that designation. And that's why, for example, all the hard-hitting pieces, even in the Australian context, have come from independent media.
Sure.
Right? So everything to do with, for example, Australia's weapons exports to Israel. All that investigative work has come from independent media, like Declassified Australia. Peter Cronow has done tremendous work on that stuff. The Pine Gap's role in, Israel's genocide has also...
Which once upon a time would have probably been done by someone within the legacy umbrella,
It would have
maybe.
been done if the perpetrator was China or if the perpetrator was Russia. They know this is all going on. They just won't go near it because they're kind of aligned to it, right? So, but the fact that, I think what's interesting to point out is that because independent media, we're seeing that the consequences of this though, because independent media has started to do the actual investigative journalism that mainstream media has refused to do because they're kind of tacitly, don't want to put Israel in a bad light. It started to push mainstream media to start doing their stories. So all of a sudden, The Guardian now has started to churn out Pine Gap stories. I did a story on the Future Fund, expanding its investments in the Israeli weapons firm Elbit Systems, which is directly profiting from the genocide. And our Future Fund, the Australia's Sovereign Wealth Fund, in 2024 expanded its investments in Elbit Systems by over 400%. A month later, The Guardian did the same story.
Yeah.
And I called them out for copy and pasting my story. But this is when independent media is now starting to put these guys on notice. Look, if you guys are going to do the work, we'll do it. If you're not going to do the work because behind the scenes you kind of support Israel, behind the scenes you kind of have racist views towards Arabs and Palestinians and people of color in general, because you refuse to allow Arabs and Muslims and people of color to have a say in coverage, then we'll do it without you. And you can play catch up, which is what they're doing right now. So, and then The Guardian did a Pine Gap story after Declassified Australia had been covering it so long.
And they're good stories that have public interest that people want to read.
Right.
Too. I mean, I've found just as a Bogan lowly State of the Nation writer, the reason I've gotten into it too was out of this frustration of not seeing stories I wanted to see, not seeing, takes that I want to see that are right there in front of us. And I've found that, there are so many things lying on the ground to write about, to speak about, really big issues that aren't being picked up in the legacy space. And just by putting them out and breathing life into them, you create a national conversation from a shitty little Substack in the middle of nowhere. It's incredible.
Let's give you a classic example, right? A live example as we speak. There is a lot of noise in the United States right now about the role of the pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC, the pervasive and pernicious kind of role of the pro-Israel lobby and how it's contaminating US democracy and how it's skewed the United States, to prioritizing Israel's interests over America's own interests. There's a huge debate going on right now in the US about this. And it's openly spoken about, the pro-Israel lobby's role. The pro-Israel lobby is playing a similar role in Australia, and we've seen that. They've worked extremely hard to suppress free speech in Australia. They're still working at it. They've worked hard to kind of silence people in a variety of different sectors, get people fired from their jobs across the board. We've been reporting on it, right? And we know they have incredibly close connections to both Labor and Liberal parties. That's why state and federal governments are always passing laws that are criminalising free speech, tougher jail sentences, all in favour of, what the pro-Israel lobby is pushing for.
Yeah.
It astounds me. Well, it doesn't astound me, but 2 years of this, not a single mainstream media outlet in this country has done an investigation into the activities of these pro-Israel lobby groups. Instead, they are amplifying them.
Right.
In every mainstream media outlet, whether it's Sydney Morning Herald, whether it's the ABC, whether it's The Guardian, you can go do a search right now and you can find stories planted where all these pro-Israel groups are cited, are quoted extensively. It's pretty much a press release from the pro-Israel lobby of like, anti-Semitism here and anti-Semitism there. They're part of the problem.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's no critique of what this destructive, extreme lobby group, which is connected to a foreign government committing the most heinous crimes that humanity can conjure up, right? So we've got to put that into perspective, right? These are people who are in support of or defending or aligned with perpetrators of a genocide. These are extremists in this country trying to suffocate any criticism of that genocide taking place. And what's incredible is you've got mainstream media pretty much serving as the communications arm of the pro-Israel lobby in helping to amplify that discourse and distract us all into a conversation about anti-Semitism, instead of mainstream media doing investigative pieces unearthing the pervasive, destructive influence of the pro-Israel lobby in Australian democracy. That's happening in independent media. That's what we're doing at Deep Cut. That's what other people are doing, like Nicholas Hanna, who's got his own YouTube channel. That's what Michael West is doing. Like, it's the independents who are exposing what is a considerable threat to Australian democracy, which is the activities of the pro-Israel lobby. We're busy focusing on, terrorism symbols that are affiliated with, flags.
A flag, yeah.
Yeah. Instead of the actual destructive work taking place against Australian democracy by the pro-Israel lobby that even Australian Jews are trying to point out, like the Jewish Council of Australia, being like, we've got to focus on these extremists who are just damaging everything.
Like right now, a good example is that Caulfield pager-themed party that's being planned by the Lions of Zion Association. You'd think if that was, a Lashkar-e Toiba or something like that doing a barbecue in Broadmeadows,
it'd be on
you'd
the
have
Herald
current
Sun.
affair and, you'd have everyone there.
Yeah.
And, you have a literal terrorist-themed party where you are literally celebrating the extrajudicial killing of civilians in southern Lebanon with pages.
Right.
It's kind of insane to think that this is going forward, and there's not a story written about it. I have to throw one up. You have to throw one.
Right.
It's kind of tough. And when you see in the US the ecosystem of the independent space, and it also leaks into the legacy sort of field a little bit. They're covering the Epstein stories. They're covering critical. They're being very critical of the AIPAC lobbies, of Israeli influence over their society on the left and the right. And it is kind of leaking out of the political mainstream into the public. What do you think is the obstacle to those kind of political discussions being silenced or not sort of developed in Australia?
I think the obstacle is, as I was goes back to what I was saying before, that I think, this country's operated in a default mode of being aligned to Israel. But beyond that, I think the way mainstream media often work is that they're aligned to power.
Yep.
Right? So they put forth, the Age says independent always. The Guardian says, we hold the powerful to account. None of that is true. They're all aligned to power. And I think what the Gaza genocide has exposed is that is the case. They are aligned to what, at the bare minimum, they're aligned to the position of the Australian government. So if the Australian government's position is that, we don't want to see people killed, but Hamas is the bad guy. But Israel, please don't slaughter 30,000, people or children. That's the position of mainstream media. So they're aligned to power. And I think one thing to kind of point out is that, as I said, power is often a small community.
Yeah.
So you have a small class of political leaders, you have a small class of billionaires, you have a small class of wealthy people who hobble on different boards and pull the strings. And then you have like a small cohort of journalists who weave in these spaces, and they're always engaging with them, and they're always relying on them to get sources and access. And then a lot of them end up being just like convinced by the world they're living in. And that world becomes their reality. The world of power becomes their reality. And they can't see beyond that. And I think what this has all kind of demonstrated is that mainstream media, because they're so immersed in the corridors of power and they're always hovering around the powerful of this country, is that they've essentially just become the communications arm of the powerful in this country, and they're completely detached from the street. And we've seen that with Gaza, right? You've seen an Australian public that's outraged, understandably outraged, as any human being who's in touch with their humanity and morality, outraged at the senseless slaughter of children that we're seeing in Gaza, with a journalistic class that's so attached to power that they just can't register that this anger exists, because the powerful say otherwise, you know? And in that powerful milieu sits the pro-Israel lobby. Because if you go and investigate who forms part of the pro-Israel lobby, they're sitting on the councils of universities, they're sitting on boards of the Future Fund, they're sitting on
SBS.
media boards, they're sitting on boards all over the country, right? They're philanthropists in the arts and culture space. They are everywhere.
And footy clubs.
Pro-Israel, exactly, and footy clubs. The pro-Israel lobby is deeply connected to the powerful, right? So it all makes sense, right? That's the powerful club. The powerful club is supportive of a genocide. The powerful club don't really care about what the public opinion is. And the public here is staring at their phones, seeing children blown up every day, being like, this is insane.
There's something to that incestuous, like uniquely Australian incestuousness with the political and the media classes. And I often wonder if it's like a small turning circle, or like just the shallow rooted kind of infrastructure where people are afraid because they can't get a job somewhere else. It's
Right.
one of three places they can go. I mean, this is particularly more difficult in that post, like Fairfax going to 9. So I think you could almost draw a line when that sort of happened. The Ida Buttrose era, the Fairfax going over to 9, and like an already concentrated and very, kind of compressed media entity was then made more subjective,
Right.
more kind of parroting those lines that we speak about. So is there this fear of not being able to pay the mortgage in Sydney that pervades most of the journalists in
100%.
Australia?
It's not just journalists, it's across sectors. Like, we've been covering it at Deep Cut. Like, every second story that we've been doing is on someone who's lost their job in whatever sector they're in because of wearing a pin, about a watermelon pin, or, having a pro-Palestine kind of writing or a sticker or something like that. So this is happening across sectors. They're using employers across the country across sectors have cracked down on people expressing their right to political thought and political expression. In this case, they're outraged at a genocide and threatening them with disciplinary action, losing their jobs, losing income. And that's why you see this pervasive fear across sectors. Some people have a privilege to kind of speak out because they're not, they have the financial security to do so. Other people just can't stomach not speaking out, and they'll do it anyway. But then a lot of people, they've got families to support, they've got children to support, parents to support. Cost of living has made life incredibly difficult. They can't afford not to be without an income. And so if you're in an organization where, as I said, your board is stacked with, people sympathetic to a genocide, and to an apartheid state, you're not, the scales aren't in your favor.
But a stenography mindset with the aim of paying the bills first
Yeah.
replaces, the heart and soul of the tradecraft
Right.
and the reason why people are meant to be in the gig to begin with. And I'm wondering if there's a new personality type that started being attracted to journalism more broadly in Australia that isn't so much interested about, telling the story and the passions that bring them towards that profession, but interested in having their mug on some TV, having
No,
it,
that's always been there. That's always been there. In media, you get those who are there for the ego, the self-interested careerists who, love taking selfies of themselves when on a plane with Anthony Albanese going to Washington. Oh, look at me, I'm in the White House and Trump's in the background. Selfie. You get the selfie journalists. And then you get the journalists who are actually in there not because of the craft, but because of the issues that they care about. And they see journalism as a vehicle towards assisting or contributing positively to that issue that they're passionate about. It could be healthcare, it could be aged care, it could be women's rights, it could be indigenous rights, it could be, in my case, Palestine and Lebanon and Syria, because my homeland's been ravaged by 100 years of colonialism. So I chose journalism as my vehicle, as a way to help my country and my society and my people. But in the process, I do it, I want to help injustice wherever I can. And I see media as a way to do that. So you get those different types of journalists, and it's very easy for audiences to spot. It's very easy for audiences to spot who's running around posting selfies and adding no substance to anything. Press release journalists, careerists, and those who actually
National Press
care.
Club
Right.
journalists.
Yeah, and those who actually care about the issues. And I think one thing that's happened with the Gaza genocide is that has become much more clear. I think it should have become clearer to audiences who these journalists are and where they sit on the scales. You've got the Antoinette, Issa, and Jan brands who've gone off and created their own little thing.
The Antouns.
Yeah, it's been maybe.
What I've got you on that, I want to speak to you. It would have been a big call to take the line that you took as a legacy journalist working at Guardian with probably a pretty comfortable wicket. And if you played it in a certain way, I'm sure it could have worked out into your favour.
Right.
But you decided to take the approach that you did, which was to stand up for your beliefs, for your profession, and to, essentially, what was the point of contention initially with your legacy employer that got you, that started having you breaking from them?
But I did play that game. I played that game for 15 years.
Okay.
I played the game of playing within the confines. You always knew that you were self-censoring. You always knew that you were playing within a small kind of, a narrow space of what you can and couldn't say with regards to anything to do with the Middle East. I played that game, and I got to the positions I got to. And that's how I got to the positions I got to, because I played it. And I kept quiet when I needed to keep quiet. And I tried, okay, maybe if I influence from the inside and change perspectives and, add a little bit here and a little bit there, I might be able to get one word in that might add a bit more nuance. But it was all for naught.
Gotcha.
Because, genocide is the lowest form to which humanity can sink. It is the crime of all crimes. Industrial scale mass killing. It is the most evil part of human nature to which we can descend. And it was just a line that I couldn't just never cross. I can't massage that.
No.
I can't massage a genocide.
That's right.
I can't play that game to minimize the most obscene of crimes. And what became clear to me was that how could the people I was working with, how could this be not what drags them across? After all that we've seen in terms of Israel's brutal occupation of the Palestinians for the last 80 years and all what the Palestinians have suffered, none of that kind of compares to what's just happened in the last 2 years. So for me, the clarity was not so much that I couldn't play this game anymore, but it was like, who are these people that I'm working with in the Guardian offices? The people who claim to be the most progressive.
Mates.
Yeah, mates, right? Progressive, they care about everyone, human rights focused. Like, how on earth are you maintaining the positions that you're maintaining? I'm sorry, but you're insane. And, like, it's an insanity that I just refuse to take part in. Anyone with a moral conscience, there was no way you could partake in that. And
WhatsApp groups with high school mates, colleagues at legacy media. I mean, what this genocide has done, it's revealed some of the character of this nation,
right,
as a core vassal
right.
in the American empire, right? So you're walking in those narrow lines that are afforded to you on the edge. And then it was a genocide that really made you realize
Well,
that it was a folly, right?
yeah, it was pointless. It was a pointless endeavor, because if I can't convince you at a point of a genocide that Palestinians are deserving of humanity and people of color deserve to be treated equally, then I feel like you're lost as a human being. And there's no going forward from that. And, when the immediate reaction of the white editors at The Guardian were to sideline Arab and Muslim journalists, to put them under surveillance, to change all of their wording, rebut their pictures, um, minimize the Palestinian experience, minimize Palestinians as human beings, not even bother to cover what was happening in South Lebanon. Um, uh, they were actively participating in camouflaging what Israel was doing as it was happening, as we were all seeing the horrors coming out on our phone. For me, it just became a point of like, this is just unconscionable. It's not a matter of, it was before you could give it the benefit of the doubt. It's like, okay, you grew up everyone's informed by the context in which they grew up in.
For sure.
And, as I said to you before, media in this country has operated in a default. A lot of these journalists and editors have been in, the mainstream media landscape for 10, 20, 30 years. You could excuse ignorance, but at some point you have to become educated to a point where you start making informed decisions. But it became clear to me during the genocide that it wasn't just ignorance that kept a lot of these white editors from covering the region in a truthful manner. It was their own implicit biases that was rooted in a racism, a colonial legacy of racism that always minimized, demonized, and dehumanized Indigenous peoples rebelling against a colonial enterprise. That's the story of Australia. It's just replaying in the context of Israel and Palestine. And that's what it came to. And so the context that they grew up in wasn't just the fact that they were in a mainstream media that defaulted to supporting Israel. It came clear to me that the context they grew up in was in a white Australia that still viewed colonial powers and colonial governments as something to be respected, as something with higher authority, and Indigenous peoples as those to be demonized and dehumanized. That's the context in which these editors and mainstream media at large were viewing Palestine. It's from the homegrown colonial era racism that is so pervasive amongst white Australia.
And that same mindset is being applied to AUKUS, to the American
100%,
alliance, to
100%.
China.
It's much deeper.
Yeah.
It's much deeper. And so for me, it's like, you know what? There's really not much more I can do here. And I'm not serving myself or justice any better by being part of this system. There's no changing the system. So I decided to leave it. And
when you saw people going from, the initial sympathy for Israel post October, on October 7 to Al Shifa to Khan Yunis, and you start saying, wait a second here, we're seeing an ultimate genocide on the cards, and you still see these colleagues or, these people sticking with this narrative, with this side, that was the thing that really blew me away a little bit. Was kind of like it got to a certain point where you're like, if you're a rational human being, whatever sympathy you have in absence of knowledge of the conflict after the events of October 7 can evaporate at a certain point when you're
Yeah.
saying, I would say Al Shifa was probably the beginning of, oh shit, this is going pretty bad.
Right.
Now, like that narrative was still maintained for another 18
Still
months after,
maintained.
it's still maintained now. And like they're so lethargic to coming to the table about even just a basic UN report,
Right.
or something like that. It feels like you say these colonial mindsets that sort of sit within legacy journalism in Australia. Like that's that's something we all sort of feel. And I want to ask you, like, what is the catalyst for someone like yourself to start up Deep Cut in, after being on your ass almost,
Right.
for sticking up for what you believe in? What was the catalyst for you? Was it before you left the Guardian where you dreamed of something like Deep Cut?
Uh, it had been lurking in my mind for some time because I saw, you know, you became frustrated within the confines, and Gaza was definitely the catalyst. Um, it was also a catalyst because I could see that the media landscape was fracturing, and self and mainstream media was self-sabotaging by maintaining its colonial approach to covering Israel Palestine, by refusing to cover genocide truthfully. Um, and so they were self-sabotaging. Audiences were leaving mainstream media. And I think with the way technology has obviously happened in the last 10 years in terms of the explosion of social media, how algorithms dictate our lives, how echo chambers are now becoming the way in which we kind of hover around in terms of our getting our information and engaging with information and content. Um, Mainstream media by technological virtue alone was fragmenting.
Yep.
But the fact that they no longer, but they always held, even within this fracturing landscape of the last 10 or so years, they always held this kind of like, yeah, but there's a lot of bloggers out there, there's a lot of social media influencers out there, there's a lot of content out there, but we're the ones you can trust because we maintain the rigorous applications of journalistic standards. So you can come to us for the stuff you can trust. Yeah, sure, there's plenty of stuff out there, but you can only trust us. What Gaza did was that mainstream media lost its credibility. It lost that mantle of trust. And so now they're just content creators like everyone else in the world.
Yeah.
They're no longer seen as like the epicenter of trust in the content landscape.
Remember those big ABC ads that they were doing post bushfires kind of period where they were just sort of like, yeah, we're the one you can trust.
It's still their
Trust
brand.
us. They still
the
do
most
it, right?
trusted
Yeah,
news outlet.
yeah.
No, you're not. No, you're not. You're just a content creator like everyone else. You have an agenda like everyone else.
Yeah, yeah.
Your agenda is camouflaging a genocide. That's your agenda. Your agenda is coddling up to the powerful in this country and distracting us with mindless drivel so we don't focus on the core issues that are impacting everyday Australians. That's what you do. And everyone now, and more people, I'm not saying everyone, because they still have large audiences, but more and more people can see that. And so why Deep Cut has come into being is because I can see there's an audience that's there that wants this. I think what was clear in the Gaza genocide was that people were not just calling out mainstream media's lack of willingness to cover the story properly, but they were starting to connect the dots between the powers behind committing a genocide to the powers behind mainstream media camouflaging the genocide to various lobbying groups, the pervasive influence of the billionaire class in our system, the thwarting of our democracy. Dots were being connected by audiences on their own. And you can see it on TikTok. You have 22-year-olds saying this. And they've got huge influences and engagement. Like, people were connecting the dots. So what came clear to me was that there is an audience out there for people who who've been turned away by mainstream media because of mainstream media's failure to uphold journalistic standards. There's an audience out there that wants truth to be told in a direct, blunt way, but still source in fact.
Totally.
And that's what we're striving to achieve. And the response, we've only been around for five months, and the response has been incredible because there's an audience just desperate for this.
It's more than a niche too. It's a chunk of Australia that's longing for this kind of information, right?
I would say, like, I'm not intending for Deep Cut to be mainstream in the sense that mass consumption.
No,
because there's never in a world in which Deep Cut will scale to cover every single beat like a standard newsroom. We are very niche, but what what I think is an important message for people out there who are thinking about becoming independent journalists, there's space to become independent journalists within your niche. So if you're someone who's very passionate about social justice and housing, for example, there is space for you to establish your credential and your space and capture an audience's attention, focusing on that issue. The issues that we're focusing on, state of democracy in Australia, which has been taken for granted and not being reported in an intentional way. Um, the foreign policy element and the attachment of Australia to the US foreign enterprise that is endangering, I guess, our national security. There's not enough investigation into that. No one covers that at all. In fact, mainstream media just kind of operates in this default. Oh, of course we're going to be part of the US alliance. We're not going to question that. Of course we're going to throw $368 billion for the US to build submarines, while we barely have investment in infrastructure in our cities, while our healthcare system's fallen to crap. Our aged care system is severely underfunded, and older Australians are left to kind of like languish to their death, while childcare has been inadequately funded, while public schools are being inadequately funded. So Australians are surrendering their quality of life in service of what?
US forces.
Yeah, exactly. We are sending money to the US so they build submarines.
We're building them houses in Darwin. We're,
Right.
we're subsidizing their outfits.
That requires investigation. Yep. Those dots need to be connected. And the thing is, these dots have always been there waiting to be connected. Mainstream media just refuse to do it because they're supportive of it.
But these are the biggest stories of our generation, almost, just being left on the deck. And look, I know you say we've always, legacy media has always favoured certain kind of empire narratives and things, but it feels like, particularly at the ABC, there was a benchmarking sort of factor to the ABC that maybe defined the narrow lines a little bit. So it was still within it, but it maybe pushed the lines a little bit in a certain direction. And in this new era where, the board's been commandeered by a bunch of, former corporates and, I think the Ida Buttrose era at the ABC was just so detrimental with ScoMo running in the background. And we've never really recovered from that at the ABC. And I think as a consequence, the whole media landscape has really shifted. I mean, you've got the Murdoch press having such a buy-in now to the ABC story chain. You'll see Insider's program, half the stories they're raising is some kind of Murdoch.
And the guests are often from the Murdoch press
as well,
right? So
James Campbell's the decision maker on half of the topics on, so that I think is detrimental. It's such a small landscape, where we really were kind of when times are good and people's hearts are full in that industry, maybe we were running a little bit better. And even in the global war on terror, there seemed to be a bit of a comfortability to pretend at least that you're a journalist, that you could cover some of these stories, objectively. But that seems to have really slipped. And I think potentially that post-Ukrainian war period, the whole narrative, it's been the West versus the rest ever since, really. And that preservationist nature of the media, which I've never really seen before like this. I've always seen it parroting the line, towing the line. But now it's kind of trying to promote something, like a way of life or a way of being as a nation that is preferred to potentially what the people want, right? Things like AUKUS, pushing that uphill. Things like the China, the Red Alert series of anti-China articles that Knott and Harcher wrote. The whole landscape is skewed about executing empire narratives at all costs, even at the expense of the integrity of the legacy media outlet itself. So these guys are losing their credibility, and in that is a vacuum that's appearing for people like yourself to enter, for people like me. And I find it really kind of perplexing because there's an economic model here.
So we're both doing part-time gigs to cover our basic capitalist expenses because they have to be covered, right? But also to alleviate the financial stress that would accompany starting an initiative like Deep Cut. The consequence of that, though, is that both Alex and I are only doing Deep Cut part-time, right? We manage to do a story a week. It's not enough because there's so much to cover. We get so many tips. We get so many people keep sending us things to cover, and sadly we have to pick and choose because because of the financial constraints, we only really have the bandwidth to do one story a week. We're getting a lot of now great external contributors helping and pitching out and writing and adding diversity to the coverage, which is fantastic. But so our main source of income is not coming from Deep Cut at all. it's coming from other places in the world that we kind of do to kind of support what we're doing. Down the road, is there a future? Potentially, but all the money that we're raising through our subscriptions right now are going back into the journalism that we're doing. And that's why I deliberately say we're community-powered journalism. Like, it's our community out there that's giving us, the few bucks a week that then add up to us being able to get someone in Gaza to write a story. I'd much rather send money to someone in Gaza who's, trying to survive and live, going between tents to a dilapidated building just to get some shelter. These are the journalists on the ground that we're trying to get to write for us. And I'd love to be able to spend money on other writers to kind of contribute. I want to create something that's viable so we can support writers to contribute and do things. So that's where the money that we've raised so far is heading towards. Now, down the road, ideally, you'd like to be able to be raising enough revenue to support yourself to work in a full-time capacity, to have the output that you want to have, that you think is in the service of the public interest, but there's another element to having community-powered journalism. It's not just sourcing revenue in order to function. It's also coming up with a model where we're acting as a collective, right? So it's a new way of kind of like thinking. It's not a top-down organizational structure of you have like a wealthy philanthropist or a wealthy billionaire or a wealthy benefactor or a government that's the source of the funding for the journalism that creates the output. That's a shortcoming of legacy media. They're dependent on the powerful in order to function. This is a bottom-up approach. This is about collectivity and collectivism at a community grassroots level. Because if you're a collective, it's kind of like that Bernie Sanders model when he did the 2016 election campaign. He was like, chip in $7. And he ended up raising so much money from a collective working class pool of supporters that enabled him to compete with the billionaire class.
With the pack class, yeah.
Right. And this is what we're doing in a media context. It's like, we are a collective outfit. We are community-powered journalism that's relying on a few bucks from everyday people who can see the value of journalism and storytelling that is for and in the public interest and not beholden to the powerful, disconnected from the powerful. And this is what we're trying to create here. It's a total, truly collective, community-powered and community-oriented journalistic model. That's what we're aiming for.
I say this to friends, we talk about the Howard era and how he kind of poured sugar on all our tongues and put us to sleep kind of thing. We were we weren't perfect, but we were kind of aspiring towards something in the Kieran Perkins era of Australian history, in that early 90s kind of period, the Gareth Evans, infrastructure, the way that we approach the region and things like that. And we've kind of lost that. And it feels like, we're in a country with I think it was the longest continuous Palestine protests in the world. We're one of the last functional liberal democracies on earth. I mean, we're seeing what's happening over in Europe.
Quasi-functional. We're moving ahead more and more into a totalitarian state. Yeah,
but semi-functional, that still has a government, talking towards certain points, on both sides that the people demand. But there seems to be a lack of buy-in from, more broadly into, these kind of these news stories, these ideas, and maybe a lack of, I don't know, a feeling in the Australian public that they can access and interact with some of these stories and these ideas. And I find that, issues like foreign affairs, for example, if we're talking about China. Yep. Thank you.
But I'll leave the pipe for you.
Oh, good. Thank you. Issues like our relationship with Indonesia, with China, with what's going on in the Middle East, there seems to be a disconnect from the public. And it's not from a lack of trying or a lack of wanting to, but a lack of entry points into this information. Now, something like your publication does open up a channel for people to access, but it feels like we're fighting against a big entity, and a big... a closed-mindedness in our political elites and our media elites that trickles down through our society. So I found it like something combating that and bringing in big ideas and telling, important stories Do you have any do you have a way of thinking, how do we skin this cat essentially, Antoun? There's a
So when I was at the Greens for 5 minutes last year, we did polling in New South Wales before the election. Um, and one of the questions that we asked was, how, if people were paying attention to what's happening in Gaza, how much do you reckon? What percentage do you think of New South Wales voters were paying attention to Gaza?
New South Wales. Well, I know the polling was over, 60% in support of some kind of stopping of the genocide. But yeah, maybe like 15, 20%. I don't know.
Paying attention?
Yeah.
Yeah, 65. 65% of people in New South Wales said they were paying attention to what was happening in Gaza.
Wow.
Now, it's not that people, and I think that's one thing that Gaza has done. Gaza, one, but B, also the way we're consuming information through our smartphones these days is providing people access to content from other parts of the world in ways in which never happened. It didn't come through our television screens, it didn't come through our radio, it didn't come through print media journalism. It's coming through smartphones and the way on Instagram and TikTok, and people were looking at cooking videos, now they're seeing a tent on fire. So and in a way it kind of narrowed the gap and the space between everyday life and Australians to the realities that are happening around the world. And that number was an eye-opener, I think, for all of us, because what it showed also, it wasn't that people weren't paying attention, but Australia has this culture of silence and a culture of apathy and a culture of political indifference.
Yeah.
We don't talk about politics openly. We don't talk about things, we don't even ask people who they vote for. It's like, which is the antithesis of a democratic society. The whole point of democracy is that you're actively participating in the political kind of structures of your society. You're invested in it. We should all be talking about politics every day. You should not only be talking about who you voted for, you should be explaining openly why you voted for that person and trying convincing that person, or otherwise, or listening to the other person to maybe change your perspective. We should all be talking to each other and learning from each other. This notion that the Australians have this notion, a lot of Australians have this notion that we're just hush hush about politics. We can't talk about things that are difficult. No, that's the whole point of democracy. Democracy isn't just going to a ballot box every 3 or 4 years and putting something in a ballot. It's about us talking about key important issues every day and incorporating politics in our lives. So
very Anglo way of going about things, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But I know what you're saying in terms of like there's a general indifference to what's happening overseas. I think Gaza has shattered that now. I think Gaza has really put on the map for a lot of Australians. We are part of this world. And the stories that I think the independent media have been coming up with about the military links between the Australian government and Israel and the genocide is just showcasing, and the fact that also that Australia is standing against international law by being complicit in the genocide and really positioning Australia in a dangerous space of being part of a club of pariahs led by the United States, which is about to bomb Venezuela. It's kind of like got Australians kind of for the first time seeing Australia's position in the world and being uncomfortable with that. Being like, why are we on the bad team? Why are we a part of this? So I think there's been a bit of awakening. Now, of course, it's not 100%. You're never going to get 100%. And of course, you're going to get that 20 to 25% of the Australian electorate that's going to be apathetic and a bit indifferent and not really know what's going on in the world and being disengaged. But you're seeing more and more people being engaged than previously.
I'll never forget seeing Ruddock and a Palestinian Christian marching over the Sydney Harbour Bridge together.
Totally.
That was a massive day for seeing that in action.
But the other thing also is that Australia is much more of a diverse country than it was, say, 30 years ago, right? So the Anglo-Celtic population of Australia is hovering, according to the last census, around 50 to 60%. So there is a significant number of Australians who are connected, as I was saying before, to different parts of the world.
Yep.
And so, for those millions, they want to know what's going on. And so I think the immediate reaction I've gotten from Deep Cut, from the work that I've been doing, is mostly from Australians who come from, non-Anglo backgrounds, who are looking for something in the media landscape that respects their knowledge and understanding of, other parts of the world. So there is an audience in this country that wants to know more about the world and Australia's involvement and engagement with that world.
Yeah.
for sure.
Look, I could talk to you forever. It's so good to be able to discuss with an independent, a coalface. And it does take, I don't want to like pump your tires, but it does take a lot of courage. It does take a lot of effort. And I know personally, I've had to work 75-hour weeks to get what I do off the ground. And you don't do it unless your heart's in it. And I think many of these legacy journalists that like to have their faces on the camera, they can't even consider doing something like this. So it cuts out, it gives opportunity, but it also cuts out a lot of opportunity as well. So I mean, I think that this independent media landscape is so nascent and young, and compared to say the Americas, where you see a very strong, lively ecosystem where people are eking out a living within it. It feels like we're at the precipice of a new kind of era, especially because of the legacy media sort of sticking where it is. So I just want to ask you, what advice do you have for young journalists before I let you go, who want to sort of go against the grain a little bit, some of whom may be working in legacy media
Right.
and appalled about what's going on,
Right.
but terrified about being able to, make that difference, to run something up the flagpole,
Yeah.
etc.
I guess my first piece of advice is like understand the landscape and understand where the landscape is going. So the way mainstream media operates is rooted in past methods that are becoming quickly outdated, um, both in terms of the delivery and the technology they're using, TV, for example, or but also in the way language is framed and structured. The both sidesism, the kind of the camouflaging of key issues. People want truth, and they want it told to them bluntly and directly. You don't need to rely on governments to give you a press release to tell you what's going on. That actually skews what's going on. So I think the method in how journalism is done has changed, and the technology is being used and deployed by legacy media is quickly becoming outdated. Um, and so understand the landscape. The landscape is, sadly, we're in a world where the algorithm determines everything. What the algorithm has done is that it's creating, sadly, but pockets of echo chambers. You've got to find the niche that corresponds to what you want to do, and there's an audience for that wherever it may sit in the cyber landscape.
Do you think also the consumers in Australia are young as well? The way information is consumed online.
Right.
Do you think Australians are still, still have a little way to go to discover that ecosystem a little bit more in the main?
Yeah, I think so. Like um, look, we know that algorithms are controlled by nefarious individuals, the billionaire class, who want to control what we think
Mhm.
and what we see, and they're working very hard. That's why you've got Zionist billionaires trying to buy up TikTok in the US. You've got Meta, which is run by in Instagram, whose head is an Israeli, Zuckerberg, who is a Zionist, trying to skew everything you see on Instagram and Facebook in a way that favors Israel.
Even Elon Musk now.
Right. So they're all participating in protecting the powerful. Um, but I think throughout history, what you find is that attempts to muzzle freedom of thought and freedom of speech never ultimately work, because there's this assumption amongst elites that human beings and the masses are passive. Masses are active. Where you try to muzzle them, they'll find somewhere else, and they'll find another way in which to find their little corners where they can speak openly and freely. So I think for journalists, you need to be on top of that. You need to be on top of this rapidly evolving, moving, and shifting landscape, right? So Instagram and TikTok today is the place where a lot of public discourse is happening, but as we're seeing those spaces being shut down, people are going to be moving elsewhere. You've got to follow where that conversation is going to be going. So be on top of the trends. Find the niches that respond to the journalism that you're trying to do, and reframe how journalism is done that prioritizes truth and not power. That's essential.
And just before I let you go, as you say that, I think about these algorithmic kind of nooses that are around the place, and there could be a button one day that silences every single one of us. So, what is a kinetic way, an organic way that independent journalists can access the community without these platforms, just in case we have to break the glass in case of emergency, right?
Well, I think starting to see it already, but in-person interaction is starting to come back, right? Like we're here having this conversation now. I think we all got, you know, we got used to kind of virtual existence accelerated by the pandemic. But I think what we're seeing our brains have all turned to mush, and we're all feeling the brain fog all the time by having our eyes glued to TikTok and Instagram and all these other platforms. And I think there's also a realization that like, this is not how I want to interact with human beings. Not by a screen, not by an algorithm telling me who I should see and who I should talk to. So I think and I've noticed, I think at the start of it, but I'm noticing there's like, there's like suddenly there's like town halls that are happening. There are community events that are happening, and people
Politics in the pub, and
and people are now coming together and talking about things in person. And what I would say, not just to independent journalists, but also to audiences, right? Journalists should be accessing audiences in person, and audiences should be accessing journalists in person. We should be coming together and talking about things without algorithms, face to face, right? And not
open mic nights, maybe.
Yeah, and not necessarily in echo chambers. Cross that divide. Have conversations with people who might not agree with, or who you haven't heard from because you're stuck in an algorithmic echo chamber and you haven't heard another perspective. Expose yourself to other perspectives. Go out there. They're in society. They're in our community. Go out and see them.
Thank you very much, Antoun.
Thanks, mate.
Appreciate it.
All good.